morning on Monday. Welcome to Ask the Theologian. Glad that you have joined us, ready for your biblical, theological, and worldview questions. And we are going to start out with a question that came in advance from Matthew. And the question is, says yesterday, we sang Reckless Love in our service, and then it goes on to talk about how the pastor then referenced God's reckless love. Matthew says, I've tried to research in the Bible any terms that would reference God's love as reckless without care or consequences, and couldn't find any. I take concern in calling God's love reckless. I think God knows His love has no consequences, just unconditional greatness and healing. Is it just me reading too much into it, or do you think this is something that we should take into consideration when speaking of God's love? You know, when I think it's a fairly popular song. We don't sing it in our church, along with a whole bunch of other popular songs. But I think that you are onto something here when, first of all, we see just what is the definition of reckless. Here's one by Merriam-Webster that we can pull up, and that looks pretty plain, doesn't it? Marked by a lack of proper caution, careless of the consequences. That's a strange adjective to give for God's love. That God doesn't care about the consequences. God doesn't hasn't put any prior thought into this. There's no proper caution put into it. It is just a reckless love. Now, I suppose I know what the author is thinking, that he is talking about the bountiful nature of God's love, but there is a word, bountiful, if you want to talk about that nature of God's love, and so you don't have to go with reckless. My guess is that this gave the author some EBGBs in his heart, and he really liked the way that felt, and so he used the word reckless instead of bountiful or some other aspect like this. Now, of course, I did take the opportunity just before our program to pull up the words to Reckless Love. It is done by Corey Asbury. And here we go. Before I spoke a word, you were singing over me. Cuckoo, cuckoo. You have been so, so good to me. Before I took a breath, you breathed your life in me. You have been so, so kind to me. It's all about me, Lord, all about me. You sing over me. You breathe your life into me. Me, 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 me. Obviously, I made up that last part of that song just in case you were listening to audio only, but so many of these so-called praise songs that are theoretically praising God, they do talk a little bit about what God has done, but it's always what God has done to me, or it's who God is for me. And me is always the center of it. It is never kind of a third person type of deal that just honors and praises God. Now, years ago when praise courses were coming out, of course, people were saying, oh, you know, the hymns, they're in the third person, but the praise courses, they're in the first person. This is so much more holy. They're in the first person. And yet, they were, you Lord, and yet me was just so much and is so much always the focus to that. Now, I do think that we ought to take and analyze lyrics of songs. And I think they ought to be accurate. And is it true that before I spoke a word that God was singing over me? Truth is, that is just totally made up. There's nothing scriptural about it. It just made Corey Asbury feel good about who Corey Asbury was, and I want him to feel good about who he is, but not by making stuff up. And so this is just, God wasn't singing over me before I ever spoke a word. Before I took a breath, you breathed your life in me. You know, I guess we can talk about the origins of life and God coming to it, God being the author of life. It goes on to say, oh, the overwhelming, never-ending, reckless love of God. There we go. Okay, is God's love overwhelming? I think it is. When I survey the wondrous cross on which the Prince of Glory died, my richest gain I count as loss and pour contempt on all my pride. It is overwhelming. Is it never ending? Remember the other song, pardon me if I don't get the words correct here. If I could write the love of God across the sky, and if all the oceans were an inkwell and every quill a pen and the sky was the scroll. Obviously, I don't have that poetically like the author did, but it talks about the never-ending love of God. So the overwhelming love of God, I can understand it. The never-ending love of God, I can understand it. The reckless love of God. Once again, back to that definition, marked by lack of proper caution, careless of the consequences. That's not what I see in the love of God. It was very planned out, very specific, of what it is supposed to accomplish. And by the way, that's true of, maybe you could say all love. Love is not reckless. Love sometimes does some things that maybe we would say are not financially appropriate, or, the financial advisor might not give. Okay, but that's not reckless. That's planned. That is weighing the consequences, that is understanding. It's not what love is. We're not reckless in our love to our spouse or our love to our child, or, when we were 16 and fell in love with a girl at some point. It's not a reckless love. It's a very thoughtful love, actually. Now, true love is. So overwhelming, never-ending, reckless love of God. Oh, it chases me down, fights till I'm found, leaves the 99. I couldn't earn it. I don't deserve it. Still, you give yourself away. Oh, the overwhelming, never-ending, reckless love of God. Yeah. By the way, for those of you who aren't watching the audio, yeah is in the lyrics. Something, this tells me that verse, I guess you call that, tells me that a songwriter, not a theologian, wrote that song. And this has become a problem in American Christian music, that songwriters are doing the songwriting instead of the music writing. It used to be that theologians wrote the words and songwriters would come along and put some notes to those words. Now, the songwriter gets a tune in his heart, and then he makes some words to fit it. And sometimes you have to stick in a yeah, because he wrote the song first, and then comes up with some words. And so that's why so often in these modern courses, you have things like this. This is a random collection of thoughts. The overwhelming, never-ending, reckless love of God, it chases me down, fights till I'm found, leaves the 99. I couldn't earn it. I don't deserve it. Still, you give away yourself. A random collection of thoughts, not a sentence, not something that someone's thought through. It is, these words fit here. I need X number of syllables to go in here. Yeah. When I was your foe, still your love fought for me. You have been so, so good to me. I felt no worth. You paid it all for me. You have been so, so kind to me. Again, very me-focused. I didn't go through here, but if you looked at all the times the me or the I or the first person pronoun was put in here, you can tell who the song is about. God loved us while we were still enemies. God died for us. So maybe if you want to take that first line, while I was still your foe, your enemy, your love fought for me. And I don't know about the word fought, but nonetheless, when I felt no worth, you paid it all for me. That's, again, sort of this psychobabble, self-worth kind of song that is so very common. It goes on, gives the yeah chorus again. And then, here's the real meaningful part. There's no shadow you won't light up. There's no shadow you won't light up. That's just kind of freaky, weird songwriter kind of stuff that maybe, again, gives somebody the warm fuzzies, but Theologically, it means nothing. No shadow you won't light up. Mountain you won't climb up. Coming after, oh yeah, it's about me again. Coming after me. There's no wall you won't kick down. Oh, our God, he's a wall kicker. Man, he climbs mountains. He makes shadows go away. Oh, me, he does it all for me. No lie. Well, actually, they kind of had to assume the word because no wouldn't fit in the song that he had already written. Lie you won't tear down. Coming after me. He's my superhero. And then the next line is, there's no shadow you won't light up. Mountain you won't climb. Coming after me. There's no wall you won't kick down. Lie you won't tear down. Coming after me. And then the next line is, there's no shadow you won't light up, mountain you won't climb down, coming after me. There's no wall you won't kick down, lie you won't tear down, coming after me. And then the next line is, there's no shadow you won't light up, mountain you won't climb up, coming after me. There's no wall you won't kick down, lie you won't tear down, coming after me. You feel better about yourself now? Not very good songwriter, can't really come up with any lyrics, so you just repeat it 4 times. You go after that, and man, honestly, there's a little bit of a manipulation psycho thing that comes in here, and my guess is that each one of these are supposed to go up a level so that you are just really oomphed by then. This is what motivational speakers do. The only one I can think of is Anthony Robbins, and he was like in the 1980s. But these motivational speakers, they come into business events and sales events, Amway and all this kind of stuff, and they give these kind of, go get 'em tiger kind of thing. I've told the story before about being down at New Mexico State University when I was a junior in high school, and they had a motivational speaker up there, and it was the future business leaders of America. That was me. And I guess I haven't got there yet. But nonetheless, we were all standing on the chair, and they had us marching, saying, I am somebody, I am somebody, I am somebody. And I was even smart enough then to know I'm a junior in high school from Espanola, New Mexico, and I ain't ever done squat. And you're trying to do this psychobabble kind of stuff. That's what this is. It sort of builds the crowd. It gives the oomph feeling. I don't even know what the music sounds like. I can only just imagine it. Through all this. And then it ends again. Oh yeah, same thing it started with. Oh, the overwhelming, never-ending, reckless love of God. Oh, it chases me down. A little bit Calvinist there, but I'll let that pass. It chases me down, fights till I'm found, leaves the 99. Oh, I couldn't earn it. I don't deserve it still. You give yourself away. Oh, the overwhelming, never-ending, reckless love of God. Yeah. My mentoree here, Corey, plays the guitar, and he tells me it has 4 chords in it. Is that what you said? 4 chords. And he said maybe even 3. And honestly, I don't really know what that means other than I said to him, so that means it's simplistic music, right? And he said, yeah, very simple. So you've got simplistic music, simplistic feel-good words for simpleton congregations. I'm not into that at all. I think that the whole time we come together ought to be worship that is based in some substance, and equipping, education, training that is based in some substance. And this doesn't do anything other than maybe a little bit of feel-good stuff and lots of theological issues there. Many, many times, those in our church will tell you, we'll be singing a song, and I'll just stop and say, hey, that verse isn't exactly right. And often I'll say, let's change it. If we just change this one word, we can get there. On this, I think I would just have to change the entire thing. I don't know how we could get there. But I think that we can do better, would be my word. We can do better in music, better than reckless love, and we ought to do better. And those out there who are leading the music, preparing the music, choosing the music, I think probably even more than dealing with whether or not reckless is the best word there, which I totally agree that it's not the best word there. But even deeper than that and broader than that, I think if we go to the fact that we ought to be able to say, hey, that the whole thing, when you look up at it on the screen, it just even looks funny. Yeah. And we can do better. We can educate our children better. We can put some theology into their minds, which is going to be richer and fuller and is going to last. These songs, I don't know, see if there's a date on this song here, about at the bottom, 2017, this was 2018 was when the album came out, it looked like. Reckless Love became Corey Asbury's first #1 single on the U.S. Hot Christian Songs chart. Woo! That is hot! And so it's 2018. That's what I was suspecting. Because these are songs designed to last 5 minutes. That it's the #1 on the hot Christian songs list, but that'll be cold in about 35 minutes. It's kind of like, when you cook carrots, they're hot for like 2 seconds and then they're cold after that. These Christian songs don't hold any heat. And you go back to the hymns and you'd have to say, well, they certainly did stand the test of time. And they taught so much theology in them. And, it's not an issue to me if you don't like the form and the tune or whatever of those old, and you want a new one, but just do something that's going to have some depth. You remember Beethoven, lived, 400 years ago? I don't know, a long time ago. And there is ability to write lyrics and, in fact, our next question will have to do with this, lyrics and music that can last. I just say to songwriters out there, quit doing third grader stuff. Do some stuff that really puts some Bible into it, some depth into it, both musically and theologically. And this is, by the way, one of the reasons why that in public high schools today, in the choir class, they will be singing sacred music. When it comes time for their choir concert at Christmas or in the spring, they will be singing sacred Christian music. You know why? Because it's the only thing written out there with depth. And so they will sing the Hallelujah chorus and things like this, and they will have that depth to it. Now, the problem is today, let me back up there. These high school choruses have said, we've got to have something with depth. The only thing out there is Christian, we'll use it. So there weren't secular songwriters writing in the 1800s about the glories of America and doing any depth. If so, they probably would sing those songs. I guess there are a few of them. It's a Grand Old Flag and some of those great patriotic songs. But they're songs that have some depth. They actually have parts to them. And they have complicated music. And you have to stop and actually practice, not just sing through it once, but you have to really get down in and practice. And so that's what the choruses are going to. And that's why they have to go to sacred music, because that's the only music out there, so to speak, with depth. Now, today, we're not doing that. So you go out again to another generation and they look for stuff with depth and there's just nothing out there. And maybe if the New Agers start writing some stuff with depth, guess what? Our high school chorus classes are going to sing New Age songs. We've got to provide something with depth, artistically with depth. That's both in literary works, in music works, in paintings and sculptures and architecture. We have just given all of that up, and I think it's shameful through that. I should note, I just discovered this on here. Corey Asbury, that is, not the good Corey, but the other Corey, has a note on the bottom. I just came when I was looking for the copyright on it. He says, when I use the phrase, the reckless love of God, when we say it, we're not saying that God himself is reckless. He's not crazy. We are. No, excuse me, I read that wrong. We are, however, saying that the way he loves us is in many regards quite so. But what I mean is this: he's utterly unconcerned with the consequences of his own action regarding his own safety, comfort, and well-being. He doesn't wonder what he'll gain or lose by putting himself on the line. He simply puts himself out there on the off chance that you and I might look back at him and give him love in return. Yeah, God didn't think ahead on this one. It's just an off chance something might. I'm going to put myself out there. I don't think he helped himself any in his rather poorly written comment there on reckless love. Thanks, Matthew, for that question. I appreciate that. And I mentioned some literary classics, and I see Pastor Roger, we've been praying for you and the loss of your mother, and he has a question in Fresno. What are your thoughts on John Bunyan's theology, especially Pilgrim's Progress? Pilgrim's Progress obviously is a work that has proven the test of time. It's that allegory of Christian on his way to paradise. I'm not sure exactly. It's been a long time since I read it. And Christian goes through a lot of rough places and meets a lot of rough people, and yet he presses on and he gets there. It is beautifully written. It is colorfully written. You can put yourself into it so much. I remember he talks about the slow or slaw. How do you pronounce S-L-O-U-G-H? Of despondency. And some of the others that come in. Now, part one, if you just take part one, I don't think you can though, but if you just take part one of Pilgrim's Progress as descriptive of the Christian life, and you don't think about it too much, it'll be okay. The problem is, it's not really talking about the description of the Christian life after a person becomes a Christian and some of the rough things they go through. It's talking about his journey to becoming a Christian, because when he comes to the end, has what really is kind of a beautiful line. He talks about, there's a hill, and he walked up this final hill. Of course, it's an allegory of Mount Calvary. He says, I saw a cross on the hill and I walked up, and he says, obviously I'm not going to use the poetic language that he has, but he says, I came to the hill and I took my burden that I've been carrying and I laid it down there at the cross. And he said it began to roll down the other side of the hill, and it rolled gaining speed, and it went then into an empty tomb, and I saw it no more. Really kind of a beautiful picture. The problem is, that is the picture of becoming a Christian. And so everything he's got prior to that is sort of this burden, this journey that we have to go through in order to become a Christian. That is to say, Pilgrim's Progress is not a grace gospel. When you get into part two, which a lot of people don't even read part two, when you get into part two, it's even more definitely a works-based gospel. Very much a Calvinist gospel, and you've got to endure these things. You've got to fight these battles to get to the point of being able to be a Christian, basically. Now, John Bunyan also wrote a thing called a map showing the order and causes of salvation and damnation. And his theology of Pilgrim's Progress is shown in this map. And so if you just go to the internet and search for John Bunyan's salvation map, you'll find it. I bring it up on the screen right here, a map showing the order and causes of salvation and damnation. Now, when you begin to look, I just give you a brief overview there, that here we have by John Bunyan, author of Pilgrim's Progress. This is the map to salvation. All you have to do is look at that and say, that's not a gospel of grace. Look how complicated that is. But notice how he comes, and he really starts on the left here. You see the covenant of grace. On the right standeth the covenant of works. Covenant of grace, covenant of works. Not the Abrahamic covenant, not the Noahic covenant, not the land covenant, not the new covenant, none of that. The covenant of grace, the covenant of works. You say, that's covenant theology. That's Reformed theology. That's Westminster Confession. That is going to be Calvinist. So if we promote John Bunyan and the Pilgrim's Progress, we're promoting a very covenant theology or Calvinist view of theology. So let me just say, hey, I'm glad that Bunyan wrote something that had some substance to it that could stand the test of time. Now I think some good dispensationalists ought to rework it and write a better allegory and carry that out. That hundreds of years from now will be carried out. So my thoughts on John Bunyan's theology is he's Calvinist, he's Reformed theology, and simply inappropriate for biblical theology. Great writing, but inappropriate theology, unbiblical theology. Thank you. And Jeff up in Trinidad, do you think there's any significance that the cherubim were used to keep Adam and Eve out of the garden and later were placed on the mercy seat? And you bring up a good reminder to us, Genesis chapter 3, verse 24. Says he drove the man out of the he drove out the man and placed at the east of the Garden of Eden cherubims and a flaming sword, which turned every way to keep them from the tree of life. Let me just speak to this word cherubims right here that the King James uses. Young's literal uses cherubs, and King James cherubims. The Hebrew word is actually cherubim. Any Hebrew word that ends in im is the plural. So you have cherub and you have cherubim. Now, interesting with Young's literal and with King James on what they have tried to do with this, because their job is to translate. And here they kind of weren't sure what to do, so they kept the Hebrew word, cherubim in the case of the King James, and they just added an S. There are cherubims. The problem is you don't have cherubim and cherubims. You have cherub and cherubim. But the other problem is cherubim does not shout plural in English like adding an S to it does. And they wanted to make sure we knew it was plural, so they did that. Young's literal, again, they used cherubs, and they just took the singular and put an S. Maybe some better argumentation that is given there. Sometimes, I don't know, let's pull up this particular word, cherubim, and see how it's used in the Bible. Cherub, cherubim, okay, it's never translated and used quite a few times, 91 times it looks like. And so all they have done is make the singular cherub and the plural always with an S. That probably does communicate plural for, the third grader that's reading that, and they should be reading that in the King James. It's a good thing to teach a third grader. We use the King James for our John Nelson Darby Academy students in the third grade, and they do just fine with it, and they learn how to be good readers and how to think with some depth. But it in a sense, helps them with the plural. Now, to the question then, is there any significance that they are used at the Garden of Eden, and then later, Exodus 25, verse 18, thou shalt make 2 cherubims of gold, of beaten work thou shalt make them, and the 2 ends of the mercy seat make 1 cherub on one end, another cherub on the other end. Even the mercy seat ye shall make the cherubims of the 2 ends thereof. Now, I think there is a little bit of significance. It would be interesting to go on and do the study of the 91 times and see how often we see cherubim and what cherubim are doing. The cherubim here are guarding, if you will, the entrance into God, into God's presence. So you have them at the Garden of Eden, where the tree of life is, and the cherubim are the ones that say, "Hey, you're not allowed to go in." And you have a similar shadows, at least, of that idea on the Ark of the Covenant. There is the mercy seat. This is where God sits, and there are the cherubs or the cherubim that guard that place or surround the presence. Now, actually, let me say that a little differently. In Genesis, you had cherub, and flame in the middle. That flame in the middle really represented God. So the cherubim surrounded God. On the mercy seat, this is, so to speak, where mercy would come and sit. That is where God would come and sit. And what do you have? You've got the cherubim on both sides. I think you could probably follow that through and say, wherever you have the presence of God, you've got these cherubim. And so the significance there, I think, tells us the role of cherubim. Michael, the archangel, is not a cherub. Gabriel is not a cherub. They have a different role. They are a messenger. And so in this sense, cherubim are different from angels. Certainly they're a spiritual being, but they're a different variety of angels, and they have their role that is given to them. Thank you. I think it is a good connection there, mainly having to do with the presence of God there that was shown at the mercy seat. Let's see, Stephen has a good word. At 7 years of age, I had no idea of the theology of the Children's Pilgrim Progress. I was just glad that the guy Christian stopped trying through all his efforts to get that burden off his back. It is some beautiful work, and there are so many things in there that are kind of valid, and with a little bit of tweaking, you could probably make the thing, especially part one, very good. I appreciate all of that. Let's see, on Facebook, one says that, I've lost the words here. Paul, sorry, sometimes I have to chase down names on Facebook. Paul says, I have changed the lyrics to the relentless love of God, which I think is much better than reckless is relentless. I suppose it fits in the same spot it's got to fit in. And since it's pretty simplistic music, you could probably fit a lot of things right in that spot. But it's interesting. Obviously, Corey Asbury knows that some people don't like the word reckless, or he wouldn't have written that footnote. So why not just change it when you start getting some feedback saying, are you sure it's reckless? Why not, you're the author, you can change the thing and do it. And no telling why he has not done that. Gary says, can you provide some comment on Numbers chapter 13, verse 33? And there we saw the giants, the sons of the Anak, which some of the giants, which come of the giants. Okay, we have the giants and the sons of Anak, or the giants, the sons of Anak, which come from the giants, and we were in our own sight as grasshoppers, and so we were in their sight. Now, here, giants, the word is Nephilim. I'm sure if we look this up, we're going to see the first use of it in Genesis chapter 6. Yes, chapter 6, verse 4. We have the word Nephilim these 3 times. Twice in this verse and one in Genesis chapter 6, verse 4. I want to go to Genesis 6 and then we'll come back to Numbers 13. In Genesis 6, there were giants in the earth in those days and also after that. Okay, we know because Numbers 13:33. When the sons of God came into the daughters of men, and they bare children unto them, the same became mighty men which were of old, men of renown. Now, I think that in the whole story of the flood, you've got to put these Nephilim in. And my interpretation, and I've got full teachings on this for those who would want it, but when the sons of God came into daughters of men, they bare children unto them. Now, when did men and women begin to have children? Adam and Eve is when that happened. So is that talking about when Adam came together with Eve and they had children? No, it says when the sons of God came into the daughters of men. Some people interpret sons of God to be good guys and daughters of men to be them bad girls. And so when good men started coming together with bad women, then they had children, and somehow that's related to Nephilim, to giants. Doesn't make any sense at all. Sons of God are angelic beings. In this case, I think, obviously not obedient angelic beings. They're demonic angelic beings, fallen angelic beings. So there was a time when demonic beings came together with the daughters of men, and they bare children to them. And these children became mighty men which were of old and renowned. And these were the giants in those days and after that. So these mighty men had a twisted DNA. I think this is where all of our Greek mythology comes from, where you've got, Hercules and whatnot, part God, part man. And that's where those stories came from. They're actually based in some legitimate history. So these were these giants. And I might say that there is a little bit of etymology and following through in other places of Scripture, looking at those like Goliath, to show that giants is the thing. But often we don't really know exactly how to translate Nephilim. That's why some of the translations just use it Nephilim, and it has become almost an English word. Now, let's go back to Numbers 13:33. Here we have, of course, the time in which the children of Israel are considering going into the Promised Land, and they sent the 12 spies, and there we saw the giants, the sons of Anak. Now, if you follow the sons of Anak, you will see that they are descendants of Canaan. Canaan was Ham's son. There was a curse upon Canaan. You may remember, we talked about it some even last week. So we saw the Nephilim, the sons of Anak, which come of the giants. So the Anaks are descendants, it looks like, of these Nephilim. And we were in our own sight as grasshoppers, and so we were in their sight. Obviously, these were giant men. Now, it's hard to tell, we were like grasshoppers. It's very clearly a metaphorical phrase there. Doesn't mean that when we looked in the mirror, we looked like a grasshopper. We had these big eyes and our arms were up, and it doesn't say, that obviously we know, it doesn't mean that we turned green in their sight. Obviously, this is a metaphor for size. Does it have to have the same ratio to say, if a man is 6 foot and a grasshopper is this big, then therefore we know that, we can reverse the math and say, therefore the giants must have been whatever ratio you would come to? I don't think you have to go there in that. I think obviously you've got a metaphor because they weren't as grasshoppers in any other form of their being, and it's a metaphor saying, hey, man, they dwarfed us. We were like little bugs. We were like grasshoppers in their sight, and so we were. And so here, the Anak were living in the land of Canaan because the Anak were Canaanites. The Nephilim were on the earth after the flood. My presumption, as I mentioned even last week, is that comes through Canaan and somehow through Ham's wife. Either she was partially, or she was one of she had some of this DNA and so it passed on, or she actually was pregnant, not with Ham's baby when she got on the ark. Could be either one of those, but somehow it comes through there, and that's where the Canaanites come from, and so the giants go on there. This is one of the reasons that the children of Anak and all of the Canaanites, and those come, are the Lord tells them, tells the children of Israel, I want every last one of them off of the face of this earth. That's not just a thing of, they've got some bad culture. They've got some bad morality. No, he says, I want that DNA eradicated from this earth, and that's what happens. Appreciate the question there on this Monday. Got lots of questions coming in here. Pastor Drew down in Georgia at the Salem Baptist Church, comparing Deuteronomy 33:2 with Acts 7:53 and Galatians 3:19. It seems that angels can be referred to as saints. Your thoughts? Also Jude 14 and 15. I completely agree with that. Let's look in Acts chapter 7, verse 53. First of all, it says, let's see, Acts 7:53, who have received the law by the dispensation of angels. Okay, angels, word is angelos here, and have not kept it. Now, the reason that, I'll turn off the yellow there and bring it up to size a little bit. The reason that Pastor Drew makes the comparison here is this dispensation, or receive the law by the dispensation of angels. And when you go then to, what was the verse? Deuteronomy chapter 33, verse 2. He said, the Lord came from Sinai, rose up to Seir unto them. He shined forth from Mount Paran. He came with 10,000 of his saints. From his right hand went a fiery law for them. So you put those two verses, and you have 10,000 of his saints, and you have Acts. The law came through the dispensation of, the disposition of angels. A number of other passages you can put in there, Galatians 3:19, which tells us, I think very clearly, yes, the word saints in the English Bible can mean angels. Now, to help prove this, let's take, I'm in Deuteronomy, we'll start right there. Let's take the word saints here, and rather than looking up the Hebrew word, I want to look up the English word, and we will pull that up in the Bible. The English word saints on the left side of your screen comes up 96 times. The first being right here where we have seen Deuteronomy chapter 33, verse 2. And when you look down through these passages, what you see is the majority of the time, first of all, you have the word saints used in the Old Testament. And when that word saints is used in the Old Testament, the majority of those times, it's angels. And the word is the holy ones. And it is a reference to angels. Then you get into the New Testament. Let me say, add one more thing. When it's not angels, it is the chosen of Israel. So, therefore, the burden of proof is on the people who say, we are saints, to tell me where the definition changed from angels or the chosen people of God into to the way it's used in evangelical theology today, where it's just used as kind of me and you, St. Drew and St. Randy. I don't see that there. I don't see any change of the definition. I just got to go with what the Bible already used, 80 some times by the time we get there, and take that definition as the one to disprove. Now, to your point, I agree totally that saints is used in the Old Testament, and it's the phrase "the holy ones," and the holy ones you just have to do some kind of interpretation there, and so they use the word saint, or we might get sanctified, or if you live in New Mexico, we've got the city of Santa Fe, the city of the Holy Faith. which they haven't done much with in the last 400 years. But nonetheless, that sanctified, holy is the idea of the Hebrew word and of the Greek word in the New Testament. The word is hagios, the word is holy. And who is the Holy Ones? That's what we've got to look up. Let's see, from Facebook, used to be a preacher planned out the service, and there were a couple of hymns, 35 to 40 minutes for, let me read that differently. Used to be the preacher planned out the service, and there were a couple of hymns, 35 to 40 minutes for messages, 15 to 20 minutes for everything else. The worship leader has taken over the service, 35 to 40 minutes of music, 15 to 20 for everything else, including the message, amen, 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 10,000 times. Was that Pastor Joel that said that? Who was that? We'll look on there. But whoever said that, yes, Joel up in Grand Rapids. I totally agree with you. In fact, in the circles I grew up in anyway, the old people called it, we always went to Sunday school followed by the service, and the service, the old timers called it preaching. Said, okay, it's time for us to close up Sunday school and go to preaching. And they called it that because that's the majority of what it was. It was the preaching. And the leader of that entire service from the first to the last was the preacher. And then somewhere along the way, we got these professional worship leaders. Even that was a long time in coming. Do you know that when George W. Truett was pastor of the First Baptist Church of Dallas, and he was there until the early 40s, it was a mega church of its day, and he, as far as I can tell, the only persons on staff, he had a church secretary, personal secretary really, had a personal secretary. And here he was world renowned, and the church was thousands of people, and he had a personal secretary. I think, the best I can tell, also through the First Baptist Church of Fort Worth, which was fundamentalist, and George W. Truett was not. But I think that J. Frank Norris only had a personal secretary. There wasn't a youth minister, a student pastor. There wasn't a song, minister of worship. There wasn't a staff. They didn't have a staff meeting. There wasn't any of that. Probably, I suppose maybe they hired a custodian. Maybe they didn't. I don't know. He had a personal secretary, and that was it. That was it. Something tells me we've gone downhill in the way we've made this corporate model of the church, and that we don't need all that kind of stuff that was done. Now, they had actually both George W. Truett at First Baptist Dallas and J. Frank Norris at First Baptist Fort Worth had massive choirs and beautiful things. But guess what? It wasn't this $200,000 a year budget kind of thing, or more than that in many places, to make this big old show, a music program, and yet they had fantastic music. It was volunteers. And the guy at Dallas, his name will come to me eventually, he had a music publishing company. And he went over to the church and he led the singing, and I'm sure under the direction completely of George W. Truett. Same thing happened in Fort Worth with a different guy. And they did all this stuff. Now, somewhere along the way, it became professional. And it started out with a minister of music. There's no such thing anymore. I know one. Minister of music. I'm sure there's others out there, but maybe 5. A minister of music actually developed a music ministry within the church where they started with a preschool choir, and they had an elementary choir, and they taught kids how to ring bells and hit sticks and learn to sing, and they taught them parts and harmony and all that kind of stuff, and they really worked on all that music. Nobody does that today. The worship leader, honestly, I don't know what he does. I think he mostly smokes cigars and plays music in his office. I don't know what they spend their time doing, because it doesn't take that long to pick the songs. And So they pick out a few songs, and they've got these professional praise teams that come in and do their little stuff, and they got to make sure their show, the lighting and all the drama and all that kind of stuff. They've just created a circus. And they don't do children's choirs anymore. They don't teach anyone how to play the piano, which is why somebody called the church the other day and said, hey, I've got a piano I'd like to give away. And I said, I got 3 of them. I said, and what I said is, churches attract old pianos, and nobody can play the piano anymore. So all old pianos end up at the church. Don't give your old piano to the church. They don't need it. They got 14 of them already. But part of this is that maybe you could argue, and I think probably you could, that, hey, that professional minister of music was doing a work in the church that was profitable overall to the church. He very much worked for the pastor. The pastor may have still selected the songs. If not, the pastor approved the songs, looked at those songs, all that kind of stuff. All of that's gone away now, and what a mess it has made. And now it's the worship service. And now they even talk, now that we're done with the praise and worship, let's come into the preaching. And just such, borrowing Jerry's term here, theological gobbledygook that has come into the church. And appreciate that. Let's see, speaking of Zephaniah 3:17, by the way, we talked about earlier, he sings over me in that particular song. And that, as far as I know, Zephaniah is the only passage that looks at this. Let's see if we can, let's see, my button has left the building. It doesn't seem to be working there, but I can tell you what it says. Many of you know it anyway. Zephaniah 3:17. The Lord thy God in the midst is in the mid. I'll get this. The Lord thy God in the midst of thee is mighty. He will save. He will rejoice over thee with joy. He will rest in his love. He will joy over thee with singing. Now, the issue there is, who is in context? Is it me? And I think when we look at Zephaniah chapter 3, it is a prophetic word about the millennial time. And it is not at all something that's saying every person, Rick and Linda and Randy and Corey, he sings over all of us. I think that just is stretching that just way out of bounds from where Zephaniah chapter 3 verse 17 is actually talking about. So and as far as I know, again, that's the only place in the scripture where you have such a reference. It's interesting. I'm going to pull up the companion Bible here on Zephaniah 3 verse 17. Okay. Interesting Hebrew, and I'm not sure I understand it. He will rest in his love. It's this word, he will be silent. And he will joy over thee with singing. It was that silence word that caught me there. He will rest. I think that in and of itself, and the context is going to show, that's a millennial kind of thing that is taking place, not a thing that's right in the here and now. Appreciate that. And we're out of time, so don't put any more questions in, but I will take the questions that we have. Let's see here. I notice you make use of other translations. What's your feeling concerning the King James Version? I have no agenda. I think I kind of answered that question on Friday, but maybe not. Was it recent? Yeah. Corey's going to find the day and let me know when that is, so you can go back to that. But I have a fuller answer there. But my feeling concerning the King James, in short, is you cannot find a more accurate English version. So my use of other translations typically is just to help me to understand why the King James selected this particular word out of that particular Greek or Hebrew. And if I can't find it there, then I'll go to the other translations and say, okay, let me see what they chose and see if I can connect the dots here and see what is happening. And I especially like it when the newer translations maybe have chosen a word that is very different from the King James. And then again, I just want to backtrack and try to get myself into the brain of the King James thinkers. And so I use the other translations sometimes for that. I do have formerly NASB stained fingers, and I don't do that anymore. So it was Thursday's program, last Thursday, that I gave a full answer to that program. Tim on Vimeo, what are your thoughts on James Cone's social justice theology? I'll say two things. One is, I don't know who James Cone is, and so I don't know anything about his social justice theology. I would be happy to look it up and see if I can put in a little more and add a little more to this question. But I agree with, I think it was Prager, but I may be wrong on this. Prager may have been the one that was talking about it. When you have to hyphenate the word justice, it is no longer justice. Justice stands on its own. It is either just or it is unjust. So social justice, by its nature, or economic justice, or racial justice, or whatever it is, actually is saying, I want to take social and make my form of justice after that. Somebody is not going to come out on the just end of that thing. Anytime you've got that hyphenated justice, somebody's going to come out on the unjust side of it. Now, social justice. I have not seen a form of social justice which was not socialism. And often it is socialism couched in Christian terms. That's what David Platt's got in his book Radical. But it is socialism. And so I'll tell you what, I will dig into his version of social justice, but usually social justice means capitalism is bad. There are too many rich people in the world, most of them white and born with privilege, and they need to step up the plate and give their stuff away in order that we can all be on the same plane socially, economically. That it is socialism. It is Marxism, and of course Marxism is socialism, and they're all tied together. And Marx's famous mantra, you remember, if I get it exactly right, let's see, to each as has need, from each, to each according to his need, from each according to his ability. I think it was flipped around. From each according to his ability, to each according to his need. And that's social justice, and that is Marxism. If I am able, that there should not be two people at a different stage. If this guy over here has more, he owes it to give to this guy to bring them, and then they're just going to march on to peace and plenty. And they'll just go at it's a utopian idea. It is an idea that has never, on a micro scale or a macro scale, it has never worked. And it is a way of bringing Marxism into the church, and they couch it in some good terms, always using kingdom passages, by the way, because the kingdom of God, the coming millennial kingdom, is a kingdom in which there is peace and plenty for all. But it is also a time in which God has removed the basis of our economic condition today, and that is scarcity. Every economist works off the principle of scarcity. So, until that is taken care of, until the curse is removed, socialism simply is not going to work. Pastor Rick, do you think that Paul was describing believers or unbelievers in 2 Timothy 4, 3 and 4 when he talked about departing with itching ears? 2 Timothy 4, beginning in verse 3. says the time will come when they, what's talking about they, can't you tell? When they will not endure sound doctrine, but after their own lusts they shall heap unto themselves teachers, having itching ears, and they shall turn away their ears from the truth, and shall be turned unto fables. But watch thou, Timothy, in all things, endure afflictions, do the work of an evangelist, make full proof of thy ministry. And Paul goes on to talk about his departure being at hand. So the question here then, is he talking about believers or unbelievers, as he says the time will come when they will not endure sound doctrine? Maybe the answer is yes. Believers will not endure sound doctrine, and unbelievers will not endure sound doctrine. It's just a general kind of end times statement. I charge thee, and who shall judge the living and quicken the dead at the appearing. Preach the word, be instant, in, out. The time will come when they. Well, the interesting thing would be to back up and find the previous time here. It would take us just a few minutes to do it. Find the previous time in which that third person, that would be what? Third person plural pronoun is used, and see if there's any definition of they up above that we could piggyback on and say, hey, you still got them in context there. But my guess is that it somewhat refers to all people, and I would even guess then, just knowing Paul and Timothy, that he's really talking about people within the church, and the time will come when they in the church will not endure sound doctrine, but they will heap up to themselves teachers having itching ears. Isn't that descriptive of today's church even? They heap up these teachers that will tickle their ears, give them what they want to hear, and the kinds of sermons that they want to have, and the theology that they want to have, and will turn their ears from the truth. I think every pastor on here, Pastor Joel, Pastor Anthony, Pastor Roger, Pastor Rick, all of us, Pastor Drew, all of us gathered here today would say, we live in a world in which you tell people the truth out of Scripture, rightly divided, they don't even want to hear it. They don't even want to accept it. Our church is a small church, and we could fit more people in our auditorium. There is absolutely no doubt about it. And we could even add more chairs if we needed to. And the only time we ever fill it up is sometimes a funeral and Christmas Eve. And there we bring in all the chairs and we fill it up. Now, why don't they come for the fabulous preaching that comes Sunday after Sunday after Sunday? I tell you why. Because they turn away their ears from the truth. They rather have fables. And they can go to some of the other churches and get fables. And the problem with that is, and I think this is where our society is now coming, at first they went for fables. After a while, fables don't tickle their ears anymore, and they don't even need it at all. They just reject the church altogether. There's a departure from the faith altogether, and I think we're seeing that in our society already, in our church society through there. And let me see here if I got all of these here. Okay, so I noticed somebody said, who was it? Cliff. My dad was custodian. In the winter, we'd pile into the station wagon and get there early so he could shovel coal into the church furnace. That's where we kids learned that's where us kids learned where they put the grape juice. Shame on you. Shame on you. That so much was the church, as the custodian was a guy in the church, and he came and he got there early to put coal in the stove. And by the way, if anyone knows where I can buy some coal in Taos, New Mexico, I would like to do so because I'm thinking about putting some in my stove. If anybody knows about that, Randy at randywhiteministries.org. I want to know how to burn coal in a high-quality wood stove. Please help. There's my Ask the Theologian question. Stephanie says, I've heard said before that God is at work in the world today. Is it accurate to say this? Uh, you know, I think that, remember the book, The Silence of God by Sir Robert Anderson? And we are, by the way, working on making a Silence of God for today. It's so out of date. The theology is very up to date, but the language in it is very out of date, and the illustrations are very out of date, so it's hard to read. So we're trying to get the Silence of God for today. Under that scenario, which I think is largely right, God's not really at work today. Now, that doesn't mean that God is absentee. It doesn't mean that God doesn't know what is going on. It doesn't mean that God does not at times intervene. It does not mean that the things that God previously set in place are not now coming around full circle, so to speak. But it does mean that God is not working in the world today like he was in many times in the Old Testament days. But what I want you to note in the Old Testament days is that you've got 4,000 years of Old Testament days, and even the enlarged type companion Bible is only that much. And so there were lots of times in the Old Testament days when they went hundreds of years with no new revelation from God, no, God is at work in the world today kind of stuff going on. So what we have today is not terribly unusual. You remember the 400 years between the Old Testament and the New Testament, often called the silent years. Those were years in which God didn't give a new prophecy. God didn't show up with a new revelation. God didn't send his son. God did, all these things that God wasn't really doing. And yet the prophecy of Daniel had already been set in motion and was fulfilling itself, was being carried out through Alexander the Great and some other things that happened between the Old Testament and the New Testament. So I think you have to answer that carefully. God is at work in the world today, not like he was in the Gospels, not like he was in the book of Acts, not like he was in the apostolic days, not like he was in the prophetic days, not like he was in the days of Judges. But even the days of Judges, there's 450 years there. And in those times of Judges, we have, 12, 15 judges that are given. They didn't, it wasn't always something that was there. So, does God intervene sometimes today? I'm sure he does. I wouldn't disallow that of God. He's got my permission. And yet, this is not a day in which God is doing the kind of work that he was in biblical days. So it's not really a term that I would use today, God is at work in the world today. Because that implies what I would think would lead to a charismatic theology in a sense, and is not there. Cliff worded that well in previous question. Hyphenated justice is truncated justice, which is not justice, is it? And appreciate that. Okay, I think that what we have is that we have finished our questions quarter hour after the fact, but I appreciate you being here with us today. We will be here almost all week. We've got Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Ask the Theologian. We've got Wednesday night, the Gospel of John. We're actually going to get in the words that are in the Gospel of John, John chapter 1, verse 1, this Wednesday night at 6:15. Thursday, I will not be on Ask the Theologian due to a funeral here that I am officiating at, but I will be at the Thursday night Bible study, and then Friday we'll have. So, only difference in programming this week is no Thursday Ask the Theologian. I appreciate having each one of you with us here today for our wonderful time gathering together, questioning the assumptions. I look forward to seeing you tomorrow. I will close with the answer to Ron's question in 1 Peter. In your opinion, does Babylon mean Babylon or Rome? Babylon means Babylon. And I see no occasion in the Bible to take it as Rome. Can I say, I was going to quit, wasn't I? But just like saints that we had earlier, if you've got, 75 times that saints mean something, carry that through. Babylon, if you've got probably more than 75 times that Babylon means something, carry it through. And so the burden of proof would be on those who say Babylon means Santa Fe. You're the one that's got to prove it. I don't see anything in there that prohibits it from being Babylon. Charlie Dyer has a book published by Dispensational Publishing called Future Babylon, and it argues for a literal Babylon all the way through the Scripture. It's a good book, Charlie Dyer, Future Babylon, by dispensationalpublishing.com. Appreciate that. We will close with that. Always, again, very good to see each one of you. Until tomorrow on Ask the Theologian, 10 a.m. Mountain Time, I hope you'll question the assumptions. God bless you.